Great, kia ora everyone, and thanks for joining us for this presentation. What I'm going to do is just briefly take you through some of the highlights of our State of Volunteering report, the latest version, and then we'll take some questions at the end. So I do ask that you just hold off until the end for these questions. So a bit of background about this project. So many of you will be familiar that we have a regular State of Volunteering report, but this one is the most comprehensive iteration to date. And this is so because we survey not only volunteer-involving organizations, but we've gone out and surveyed volunteers themselves. And we've also run focus groups with target audiences and target stakeholders. So we ran focus groups with youth volunteers, volunteers with disabilities, Māori volunteers, and also a great deal of other stakeholders and major figures in Aotearoa New Zealand's volunteering networks. And this was a way to enrich the data sources that we had to make sure we could really paint a comprehensive view of the sector as it exists. It also draws on statistical data from Stats NZ, and it has a huge body of desk research behind it in a way that's much more comprehensive than the previous iterations. And throughout the whole project, we've tried to make sure that the voices of volunteers are at the forefront of this work. And so you'll see lots of quotes and stories from volunteers throughout this piece in a way to show the kind of heart of volunteering, to show the voices that are really central and key to the voluntary sector. In the report itself, we divide the findings into 6 key themes. And I should say, for those who are pressed for time, you can read any of these sections by themselves. They're fairly self-standing alongside the executive summary. And so we explore issues like why people volunteer and why they might stop volunteering. We look at this idea of volunteering and whakawhanaungatanga, relationships and connections being one of the core motivations for people to volunteer. We also look at the language and conceptualization of volunteering. So, how the public sees volunteering, how the organization themselves sees volunteering, and what volunteers themselves think about the benefits of volunteering. We devote time to talking about the recognition and the value of volunteers and of volunteering, and how we can acknowledge the contributions that volunteering does, that volunteering makes to society more generally. A major part also is analyzing the impact of COVID-19 on the voluntary sector, as well as lessons that are important and useful to draw on going forwards. We then address the issue of diversity and inclusion in both theory and practice, with some fairly surprising results in here as well, which we will go through. A good place to start is to look at some of the Stats New Zealand surveys and data sets that we've analysed from the previous and most recent data sets. And we've found that fairly constantly half of us volunteer, so it's about 50.7% over the age of 50.7% of people over the age of 15 volunteer. And this has stayed fairly constant throughout. We also found that most people volunteer indirectly, or informally, rather than through an organization directly. And this again reflects what we know from the anecdote and from speaking to people about what they've been doing with their time. And we found that women volunteer slightly more than men, at 53.7 compared to 47.5. And what's noticeable, again, according with the media reports and anecdotal evidence, is environmental volunteerism is growing in popularity. And this accords again with what people are doing when you speak to them, and also what we're seeing in the media with increased attention to climate change and environmental pursuits. One thing that's really important to understand as a sector is why people volunteer. And it's very good news to see that 90% of people volunteer out of a desire to contribute to their community. 17.9% volunteer to make friends. And I should note that these are not mutually exclusive options. So people were asked to tick their primary motivations for volunteering. but we see the overwhelming majority comes from a sort of altruistic motivation. 17.9% comes from this idea of wanting to make friends and form connections. And 10% identify, job experience and enhancing their CVs as important and primary motivations. And these, again, accord to an extent with what a lot of people have been saying in advance of the survey. But this sort of comprehensive data, confirms what we've been seeing across the sector. It's also interesting to know how people find out about their volunteering activities. We found it fairly interesting that word of mouth remains the most common method for finding out about volunteering. So about 52% of people found out their current role through volunteering. But for those under the age of 35, so let's just say 35, not 3, about 58% of people found this out by social media. And so that shows an interesting change from what we've been seeing, that social media continues to be a major source of recruitment for these people. And 42% of people found out the role through a current internet search or somewhere online. And this shows again the increasing prevalence of finding out about volunteering through online sources. One reason and one topic that we explored is the issue of youth volunteers. So in previous State of Volunteering reports, we found that youth were not always well represented in the survey responses for various reasons. And so to rectify the absence of these voices, we went out specifically to engage with youth volunteers and engage them in these focus groups. And here's one quote that a youth focus participant said, the nature of volunteering evolves, and those who complain about not enough young people joining should perhaps ask themselves, why don't more young people want to join our organization? What are we doing wrong that is putting off young people from joining? And this is a way that came out, a way of refocusing and reorientating how we see the onus of volunteering. Instead of seeing the problem as youth not volunteering, we can reframe this and see it as what are we doing wrong, or what could we do more to ensure youth are finding our activities attractive to contribute their time towards. On the issue of the language of volunteering, we found a really interesting way about how people see the value of volunteering. And we've divided this into a tripartite classification, so between a private, public, and organizational way of discussing these benefits. So if you ask an individual what they think, the private benefit, they'll talk about the importance of making friends, enhancing their CV, wanting to do good. If we ask the organization what they benefit from or what they find good about volunteering, they'll often talk about key performance indicators. We reach X number of people, we, raise this number of funds. If you ask the public as a whole what the value of volunteering is, they go much broader and say, look, we think it's great that, care is shown and symbolized around the country for these kinds of issues. And this is just a very simple way of seeing how, when we talk about volunteering, there are different ways in which we use the language. So when people ask you, what's the value of volunteering, it can be helpful to divide it into these different ways. One practical implication of this distinction is in how we advertise volunteering impact and opportunities. When we're recruiting volunteers, we find that telling them actual statistics or data does not always motivate them to volunteer. If we tell them, volunteer for us because you'll reach 500 people a month, that's unlikely to create the kind of ethos that brings people into the volunteering world. And so couching it in terms of what we call the private or the personal value language makes it much easier. So we say, look, if you want to make an impact on the lives of, someone like Anna, come and join us. Couching in terms of stories and personal impacts is a good way that we've found organizations, we've found is much more successful for organizations to succeed in recruiting volunteers. COVID was, of course, a major theme during the survey period. And we've conglomerated and gathered a lot of data from surveys, as well as asking people specifically in the focus groups how they found themselves impacted by COVID. And this gives a kind of summary of what we found. And so, so many participants, despite supporting the general approach of mandating vaccines, nevertheless noted that they have resulted in much polarization and angst among different factions of their organization. This has introduced an aspect of negativity to the volunteering experience, with the usually social place turned into a more prescriptive environment with stricter rules. Now, what this insight is showing is that volunteering is often about connections and a general good vibe. And the problem with the COVID mandates is that even if they were justified and people felt they were justified, they found it much harder to be spontaneous. They had to think about, PPE rules. They had to think about social distancing. They had to think about those who were not vaccinated. And this naturally created a barrier between those who supported the rules and those who did not. And so it induced an additional level of conflict and perhaps negativity that is normally absent within most volunteering organizations. There's a quote here from a volunteer manager in a major Dunedin charity who said, "We had to cancel all our events over the last 18 months, including our annual appeals, which reduces our profile in the community and lessens the money. Health concerns are putting off volunteers from being involved. Lack of face-to-face interactions with staff, volunteers, and community reduces connections, motivations, and resilience." Again, we found that people who relied on annual appeals, for example, collecting, buckets outside, collecting gold coins, collecting donations on the streets, these organizations took a big hit. Op shops that sold secondhand clothes also found themselves hugely impacted by COVID rules. And again, this reduces the profile, which is very important, especially for smaller organizations. A lot of older volunteers in particular were more worried about volunteering, or those who had, pre-existing health conditions. And because of this idea of whakawhanaungatanga and the key value of connections within volunteering, a lot of people just found themselves less motivated when they couldn't hug or interact with people in quite the same way. And it shows us again and reconfirms the value people place on connections in the volunteering space. One thing that really emerged from surveys with organizations that reported COVID impact was those who had robust electronic systems found themselves less affected by COVID than those who did not. And so I mean, for example, things like, video conferencing platforms in place, online databases to manage volunteering hours and volunteering activities. All these things really helped organizations stay resilient and sit out and weather the storm that was COVID. And so we found that much more helpful for these organizations, and they were able to escape the worst of the COVID impacts on volunteering. This is not to say that they didn't experience any problems, but when we run a statistical comparison, we find that there's a very strong correlation between organizations having these robust electronic systems and reporting, above average retention and engagement rates for the years concerned. I just want to flag a bit about the next steps that we're going to do. And so we want to look a bit further into our core data set to see if we can see any further correlations between the variables. So one thing we want to look at, for example, is whether the length of volunteering service tracks volunteers' age. We also want to see things like if you rate the fact that you don't feel as valued in your volunteering organization, are you more likely to quit? Or is your retention rate much lower? And these, we think, will help organizations with strategic planning, as well as reinforcing some of the initial instincts that we might have. We're also going to go a bit deeper into the regions. So we know that volunteering is not, something uniform across the country. And so we want to look further into whether, for example, there is a divide between rural and urban centers for volunteering, whether being in the North or the South Island or being in a smaller town has a big impact on all the parameters that we measure volunteering success by. And the initial and sort of hopeful end result is that we're going to be producing sub-reports. First, on the regional breakdown of the data. So we're going to be looking in as much detail as we can anyway at the different regions and contexts. We're going to hopefully analyze the volunteering space in the youth, and so to see whether there are any further lessons that can be learned. And this is important because youth is often a good way to future-proof an organization and to think about succession planning when a lot of organizations report aging volunteers as a major concern. And some early works from our Māori focus groups will allow us to conceptualize further this idea of mahi aroha, which we hope can be informed by some of the data and the focus group results from our report. And so those are just some of the exciting next steps that we hope to participate in over the coming months of this year. But as I note, this is just a very brief summary of some of the salient points of the report. A full version is available on the link shown. And of course, we do welcome any questions and comments, and you're very welcome to contact me as well if you have any thoughts about the research or about future directions. So I'll leave it there for now, and I'm very happy to take questions and discussion.